Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a very great honor for me to be here with you this evening. And I'm very proud to be part of this wonderful organization that is doing such great work in eliminating hate and prejudice from our society. My grandfather was a very young lawyer when he went to South Africa to establish a legal practice so that they could pay back the loans that the family had taken for his education in England. But when he arrived in South Africa, and within a week, he became a victim of prejudice and hate and was literally picked up and thrown off the train because of the color of his skin. That incident shocked him into anger, and his initial reaction was to seek justice through the normal means. But when he thought about it, he felt that that was not the right course and that we had to find a better way to change people's hearts and minds. And that's how the philosophy of nonviolence evolved. And he began to practice it in South Africa. And he said in his writings, and he also said it many times to us when we were living with him, that every day he discovered something new in the philosophy of nonviolence. That it's something so profound that we haven't even seen the depth of the philosophy there. He used to describe it as being an iceberg, that you see just 1/10 of the philosophy. There's a lot of it still lying undiscovered, and we need to have that kind of an open mind that we can discover the philosophy and make it a part of our life. I don't agree with many of the scholars today who say that nonviolence is a strategy to use when it is convenient and discard when it is not. I don't think so. I don't think that we can be nonviolent at one moment and violent at the next moment. I think we either accept nonviolence or we don't accept it. But there can't be a middle way there. My grandfather learnt about nonviolence quite early in his life. As you probably know, he and grandmother were both 13 years old when they got married. And they started living together at the age of 15 or 16. And at that age, grandfather said that he didn't know who the boss was going to be in that relationship. He started going to the library and reading books on the subject. And obviously these books were written by male chauvinists because all of them talked about how the husband should lay down the rules and enforce them strictly. And after reading this, grandfather came home one evening and told grandmother that from to stir out of the house without my permission. That is the law and you're going to obey it and I want no arguments about it. And grandmother quietly heard him, didn't retort, didn't say anything. She just turned around and went to bed. Got up the next day and she continued to do what she always did. Continued to go out and visit and never bothered to get grandfather's permission. And after a few days, when grandfather saw that she was not obeying him, he confronted her again and he says, "How dare you disobey me? Didn't I tell you that you are not to stir out of the house without my permission?" And at that point, very quietly, without raising her voice, grandmother said that I was brought up to believe that we must always obey the elders in the house. The elders in this house are your parents. If you are telling me that I should not obey your mother but obey you instead, let me know so that I can go and tell your mother I'm not going to obey you anymore. Of course, grandfather couldn't tell her to do that, and so the whole matter was settled without anybody losing their tempers. And grandfather acknowledges that that was the most profound lesson in nonviolent conflict resolution that he learned there. So nonviolence is about learning how to deal with your anger and being able to channel that energy into positive action. He felt anger when he became a victim of prejudice, and he initially wanted a violent response to it, but he stopped himself and said that's not what we civilized human beings need to do, that we need to find better ways of dealing with this. And I think that's the crux of the problem today. We have built a whole culture of violence over the years, and that culture of violence dominates us to such an extent that everything about us is violent. Our relationships with each other, the way we bring up our children, everything, our language has become violent. Everything about us has become violent. And we have to recognize that and turn things around. Otherwise, we are just going to go deeper and deeper into violence. And we have already reached the stage when we think that human beings are basically violent people, that there's nothing we can do about it. They are born violent and they're going to be violent all the time. We human beings are not violent people. If we were violent people by birth, we would not need military academies and martial arts institutes to teach us how to fight and kill. We should be born with those instincts. But the fact that we need these academies to teach us indicates that violence is a learned experience. What happens is anger is something that we are born with. But instead of learning how to deal with anger positively and constructively, we ignore that very powerful emotion totally, and the result is that everybody ends up abusing anger. And when we abuse anger, the next step is violence. And that's how the whole cycle continues to grow. And grandfather realized that one of the first things that we need to learn in the philosophy of nonviolence is how to understand our anger and deal with it effectively. I was taught this at the age of 12 because I became a victim of prejudices and hate in South Africa. When I was growing up, I was always judged by the color of my skin. I was beaten up at the age of 10 by whites because they thought I was too black, and then by blacks because they thought I was too white. And I wanted eye for an eye justice. And it became such an obsession with me that I started going to the gymnasium and doing exercises and pumping iron so that I could deal with these people physically. And that's when my parents decided to take me to India and give me the opportunity to live with grandfather. And the first lesson that grandfather taught me was about understanding the anger that I felt. He said, anger is like electricity. It's just as useful and just as powerful, but only if we use it intelligently. But it can be just as deadly and destructive if we abuse it. So just as we channel electrical energy and bring it into our lives and use it for the good of humanity, we must learn to channel anger in the same way so that we can use that energy intelligently and for the good of humanity rather than abuse the energy and cause death and destruction. He suggested that I write an anger journal. He said every time you feel angry about something, don't act on it, but take time out and write a journal. But write the journal with the intention of finding a solution to the problem, and then commit yourself to finding a solution. Now, this is very important because a lot of people today tell me they have been writing an anger journal for a long time, but it hasn't really helped them because every time they go back and read the journal, they are reminded of the incident. And they just become angry all over again. Because we pour our anger out into the journal, and the journal then becomes a reminder of the incident. And that's not very constructive. So it's important that we write the journal with the intention of finding a solution and then commit ourselves to finding a solution. I did this for many years, and I must say that it helped me considerably in learning how to deal with my anger positively. But after learning this profound lesson from grandfather, I was 12 years old, quite a feisty 12-year-old, and I decided to test him and see whether he himself had learned the lesson or not. And this was the time in his life when he was involved in many important things. He was not only fighting the British for India's independence, but he was also concerned about the emancipation of Indian women, about the education of Indian children, and the emancipation of the so-called untouchable people in India. He was concerned with all of these problems, and he had programs going on simultaneously in all these different fields. And all these programs needed to be funded. And since the British controlled much of the funding, they were not willing to give him the money. So he had to raise the money himself. And he decided that the easiest way for him to raise money was to sell his autograph. And every morning and evening, when hundreds of people would assemble for his interfaith prayer services, they would all seek his autograph. And grandfather had placed a fee of 5 rupees for each autograph, which in today's money would be roughly $5 for an autograph. And while I was living with him, it was my duty to go out into the audience and collect the autograph books and the money and bring it to him for his signature. And one day I thought to myself, if everybody could get his autograph, why not me? After all, I'm his grandson and I deserve an autograph too. But I didn't have any money, and so I got myself a little booklet and I slipped it into the pile, hoping that he wouldn't see the absence of money in there. But when he came to that book, he said, "Why is there no money for this autograph?" And I said, "Because it's my book." And he said, "Well, you should know that I don't make an exception even for grandsons. That if you want an autograph, you will not only have to pay me for it, but you'll have to earn the money and pay me. Don't ask your parents for it." And I said, "No way." I said, "You're my grandfather and I'm going to make you give me this autograph free." So he laughed and said, "All right, let's see who wins." And from that day, every day when he was in high-level political discussions with Indian politicians or British politicians, I would barge into the room with my autograph book and thrust it in his face and demand an autograph. My logic was that just to get rid of me, he would sign the book and give it to me. But instead, every time I became too boisterous, all he did was put his hands across my mouth, pressed my head against his chest, and went on talking politics. In fact, on many occasions, the other politicians used to get exasperated and tell grandfather, "Why don't you give him the autograph? He disturbs the meetings every day." And he would just say, "This is a private joke between the two of us. You don't have to get involved in it." Now, the long and short of it is that he never did give me the autograph. And he never, ever told me to get out of the room and leave him alone, as we would do if our children or our siblings came into the room while we were working on something important. We sometimes very rudely tell them to get out, leave me alone, can't you say I'm busy? He never, ever did that to me. And that's when I was convinced that if he was able to control his anger to that extent, if we achieve 50% of it, it will make a tremendous difference in the level of violence that we experience today. And so we have to make a definite attempt to understand our anger and be able to channel that energy constructively and positively. But he also taught me the depth and breadth of his philosophy of nonviolence through a little pencil. A little 3-inch butt of a pencil became a big lesson for me. I was coming back from school, and I had this little pencil in my hand, and I happened to look at it, and I said, this is too small for anybody to use. And I wanted a bigger pencil, and without a second thought, I threw the pencil away, because I was sure that grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I asked grandfather for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away, and on and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, you must be joking. He said, you don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark? He said, oh yes, I do. Here's a flashlight. And he sent me out with a flashlight to look for this pencil, and I must have spent about 2 hours searching for it. And when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, I want you to now sit here and learn 2 very important lessons. The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world, and because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty, and that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these little things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we overconsume or throw away and waste, and the hundreds of things that we do every day as part of our life, that we are all committing violence, directly or indirectly. And to make me understand this lesson thoroughly, he made me draw a family tree of violence on the same principles as the genealogical tree, with violence as the grandparent and physical violence and passive violence as the 2 branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that I had experienced during the day. Things that I may have done to other people or people may have done to me or whatever it was. Everything had to be analyzed and put in their appropriate places on that tree. Now, if it was the kind of violence where physical force is used, murders, killings, beatings, wars, punching, all of these things that we do to one another where physical force is used, that would go under physical violence. But if it was the kind of violence where we don't use any physical force, and yet we hurt people, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, that would go under passive violence. And that would be things like wasting resources, over-consuming resources, calling people names, judging people by the color of their skin or their gender or whatever. And all of these things where we don't use any physical force, but we hurt people. And the way I had to find this out was by asking myself a simple question, that if I did this action, would it hurt somebody or help somebody? And if I came to the conclusion that it would hurt somebody, then it would go under passive violence. And when I did this self-introspection, it was a form of self-introspection. When I began to do this, within a few months I was able to fill up a whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence. The physical violence didn't increase very much because there's a limit to how much physical violence you can commit. But the passive violence just went on endlessly. And that's when grandfather explained to me the connection between the two. He said, we commit passive violence all the time, every day, consciously and unconsciously, and that generates anger in the victim, and the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice. So it is passive violence that fuels the fire of physical violence. So logically, if we want to cut off or put out the fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change that we wish to see in the world. It has to begin with each one of us. And it's only when we change that the world will ultimately change. But if we are going to wait for somebody else to change first, nobody is going to change. So we have to do this introspection. We have to find out how we contribute to violence in society, how we contribute to hate and prejudice in society, and rectify that. And we all are guilty of that. I mean, you have this exhibit of the 7 social sins that my grandfather talked about. Each one of them has a different aspect of life, including commerce and politics and all of these things. We commit violence in each of these fields there, even in our relationships. Our relationships today are so poor because they are all based on self-interest. We are always wondering, what am I going to gain from this relationship? And if I don't gain anything from it, why should I bother to cultivate the relationship? And that's a very negative way of building relationships. Relationships, ideally in a culture of nonviolence, would be built on the 4 principles of respect, understanding, acceptance, and appreciation. We have to respect each other and respect ourselves and respect our connection with all of creation. Today a lot of us seem to think that we are independent individuals and we can do whatever we like and it's nobody's business. We are not independent individuals. We are interdependent, interconnected, and interrelated. And it's only when we respect that we will understand who we are and what we are and why are we here on earth. We are not here by accident. We are here to fulfill a purpose. But we will know what that purpose is when we understand what our connection with each other is. And once we understand that, then we will be able to accept each other as human beings. And we will stop identifying people by the labels that we have put upon ourselves. Today we have so many labels to identify people. We have religious labels, economic labels, gender labels, race labels, you name it, and we have a label. And every time we put a label on somebody, we are building a wall between that person and ourselves. So we have to remove all those labels and begin to look at each other as human beings and respect each other as human beings. And it's only when we are able to do that that we will be able to appreciate our own humanity. So that is a constructive way of building relationships between people, where we won't have any conflict and violence there. Or maybe we could reduce the level of conflict and violence between people. So these are things that we are to be very conscious about. And the result of our poor relationships reflects on everything, the way we parent our children. We have gotten so accustomed to justice being revenge. Our whole justice system is based on revenge. Unless somebody is made to pay for what they have done, we are not satisfied, we are not happy. We have to make that person pay. And that is not justice. That is pure revenge. Justice means reformation. It means we need to understand that the person who has done something wrong has done it out of ignorance or out of some compulsion, and that person needs to be reformed and brought back into mainstream society. So prisons today should not be places of punishment. They should be places where we reform people. And that goes even for our children. Every time we threaten our children at home with punishment if they misbehave, we are teaching them the first lessons in violence, that if anybody does anything wrong, they need to be punished. And that is how we perpetuate the culture of violence in human societies. In a nonviolent culture, it's not punishment that is important, but penance. We were brought up in a nonviolent home. Our parents, my two sisters and our parents believed in total nonviolence. And so we were not punished when we misbehaved, but they did penance instead. And I know several occasions when, because of something that I did or my sisters did, my parents would fast, maybe for a day, depending on how serious the offense was, a day or 2 days. They would sit at the table, they would feed us, they would talk with us, and they would tell us that they were not good parents. They didn't teach us proper behavior, and therefore they have to do penance for our wrong. And because the relationship between them and us was based on so much mutual respect, we felt awful when our parents had to do that, and we made sure that we never did that again. And that is how a civilized society based on a culture of nonviolence would behave. But if we subscribe to violence, then we are going to have more and more of violence and more of hate and prejudice and all the negative things that we are seeing today in human beings. It's all part of that culture of violence. Because culture of violence brings out all the evil that resides in each one of us. This whole concept that we can divide the world between good and evil people, and if we eliminate all the evil people, we will have a world full of good people, it's wrong. We can't divide people that way because each one of us is capable of doing good or evil, depending on what buttons are pressed. So whom are we going to eliminate? The whole human race? We can't do that. We've just got to bring out the good in every human being rather than bringing out the worst in every human being. My grandfather, when he was beaten up in South Africa by some white people, those people were arrested by the police, and they invited grandfather to come to the police station and file charges against the men so that they could be punished. And grandfather went to the police station and he said, I don't want to file charges against them because that's not going to help them understand that what they did was wrong. He says, I'm going to forgive them. And he told this right in their presence. He said, I'm forgiving you for what you have done, and I'm going to allow you to walk out of this prison free. And I hope that this will teach you a lesson, that what you did was wrong, and that not everybody is evil, and that we need to learn to behave well with people and not judge them by the color of their skin or anything. And those 4 people walked out from there and changed. 3 of them became lifelong followers of my grandfather. And that was that simple act of forgiveness. I had that same experience when I was living in India. And in 1968, an Indian friend of mine from South Africa wrote to me saying that he was coming to India for the first time. He was very nervous traveling outside the country. And so he asked me if I would receive him when he arrived in India and make arrangements for his stay. And because he was a very good friend, I said, all right, I will do that. He was coming by ship. And the ship arrived in Bombay at 10 o'clock in the night. And I was the first Indian to go on board. And instead of meeting my friend, I met a strange white man who grabbed hold of my hand and shook it profusely and introduced himself as Mr. Jackie Basson, Member of Parliament from South Africa. The moment he introduced himself, I realized who he was, that he was a member of the Nationalist Party. He was an outspoken supporter of racism and apartheid, and that all the prejudice and hate that I had suffered in South Africa, that he was indirectly responsible for it. And at that moment, in that flash of a moment, my desire was to insult him and to tell him to jump into the ocean, that I'm not going to do anything for you. I know who you are, and I'm not going to do anything for you. But I immediately stopped myself and I said my parents and grandparents would never forgive me if I did this. And so I responded in friendship. I shook hands with him and I introduced myself. And I told him that I was a victim of apartheid, that I was forced to live in India because his government wouldn't allow me to bring my Indian wife back with me. But that I'm not holding it against him. I'm going to treat him as an honored guest in this country, and I'm going to do everything possible to make their brief stay in India as comfortable as possible. And from early in the morning till late in the evening, my wife and I took his wife and him out into the city and did everything touristy. Went to tourist spots and did shopping and whatever they wanted to do. And all through that time, we talked about apartheid as friends. And I didn't expect to transform him. I just wanted to find out how he was going to justify apartheid to me. And he was making a valiant attempt to justify it. But on the fourth and last day, when we met and said goodbye to them, both of them embraced us and shed tears of remorse. I mean, tears were streaming down their cheeks. And they said, in these 4 days, you've opened our eyes to the evils of apartheid. And I want to assure you that we are going to go back and fight apartheid. I was still a skeptic at the time. I wasn't willing to accept this just because he said so. I told my wife, I said, let's wait and see, because these people have a habit of coming out of the country and saying one thing, and when they get back into the country, they do the old things again. So let's wait and see whether he really means it or he's just making us feel good. And we followed his political career for the next 5 or 6 years, and I must say that man was changed. That he not only spoke against apartheid, he lost his election, he was thrown out of his party, but he remained firm in his belief that apartheid was wrong. And I think about that incident very often and wonder if I had taken that revenge I initially wanted to, if I had insulted him, I would have had that momentary satisfaction of having insulted a white man and gotten away with it. But that would be all. He would have gone back a confirmed racist and said, these damn Indians deserve what they get, and nobody would have changed. But by responding to him in friendship, I was able to transform this man who was basically a confirmed racist. He believed that apartheid was wrong, was right, and that racism is the way of life there. So this is the power of nonviolence. We have to understand how nonviolence is used. It is used through respect and love and trying to bring out the good in the person, not the evil in that person. And that can be done only when we understand the philosophy and practice it thoroughly. There's another episode that I want to share with you before I end. I know I'm going on for too long. But this is an episode will indicate to you how nonviolence is applied. In 1913, before my grandfather decided to leave South Africa and come back to India, he launched his final campaign against apartheid. And as he always did, he informed everybody from the Prime Minister down to the local police precinct what he was going to do, where he was going to do, and why he was going to do it. And after he made that public announcement, the railway workers, South African railway workers, decided to go on a strike for better working conditions. And grandfather, when he read this in the newspapers, he realized that this was going to be a very major issue, which was going to affect everybody in the country. And the government's attention will be focused on that issue. And it would be unfair of him to put additional burden on the government. So he announced the withdrawal of his campaign. And when he announced that, the workers of the railways came to him and he said, look, we are also nonviolent. Strike is a nonviolent tool. And we are fighting the same enemy. So why don't you join us and we make common cause of this? And grandfather said, I don't have any enemies. I'm not fighting enemies. I'm trying to reform my friends. And he said, you have a different agenda and I have a different agenda, so you go ahead and do what you have to do, and then I will do what I have to do. So the workers went on strike. And there was so much anger and frustration in the workers that they expressed it in their actions every day. When they went out into the streets, they were shouting angry slogans and down with the government, and all kinds of anger was demonstrated there. So it was very easy for the police to infiltrate the ranks of the workers and cause an incident that gave the police the justification to crush them. And within 4 days, the whole strike was crushed and the workers had to go back to work without gaining anything at all. And then grandfather launched his campaign, and it went on for weeks. And ultimately, the Prime Minister called grandfather to sign an agreement in his office. And at that time, he confessed to grandfather. He said, I could deal with those workers because there was so much anger and frustration that I could exploit that and cause an incident and crush them. But I don't know how to deal with you because you have so much love and compassion and understanding for us that I can't crush you. And that is the crux of the philosophy of nonviolence, that we don't treat the other as an enemy, that we respect them as human beings, and we transform them through our respect and love and understanding and appreciation and suffering, self-suffering, that we are willing to suffer ourselves, do penance, but we are not going to make you suffer. And that transforms people, and that is the kind of nonviolence that we need in our countries today, so that we can become more civilized and be able to live happily and peacefully with everybody. The world is becoming smaller and smaller. The societies are becoming multiracial, multicultural everywhere. And we've got to learn about those diversities and accept those diversities and respect those diversities, not fight against them and keep them away from mainstream society. One of the things that my grandfather was always very concerned about was this whole concept of nationalism. He said the worst thing that could happen to anybody is this idea of nationalism and patriotism. He said that makes us believe that we can safeguard the corner of the world we live in and not have to bother about the rest of the world, that they can go down the tube, we don't care. And that is what's basically happening in every country. We are just concerned about our own country. We don't care about the world. We think that we can survive without the world, but we can't. We are all interrelated and interconnected, and if one part of the world is going down the tube, we are going down with them, however powerful we may be. So we have to have this vision of one world where we respect the idea that the security and safety of every nation depends on the security and safety of the whole world, not privately by any one nation. So these are some ideas of nonviolence that I thought I would share with you. I could go on speaking for hours on this subject, but I would like to end now with one final story, a story that my grandfather used to be very fond of telling us, of an ancient Indian king who once became very curious about the meaning of peace. And he invited all the intellectuals in his kingdom to come and explain the meaning of peace. And everybody came there and did their best, but nobody could satisfy the king. And then one day there was an intellectual from another town who came on a visit, and the king asked him the meaning of peace. And this intellectual said, the only person who can give you a satisfactory answer is an old sage who lives outside your kingdom. But he is so old that he cannot come to you. You will have to go to him and ask him this question. So the next day the king went to this sage and asked him the meaning of peace. And this sage quietly went to the back of the house and came back with a grain of wheat and placed that grain of wheat on the king's palm and said, here is your answer. And of course the king didn't know what a grain of wheat had to do with peace, and he didn't want to show his ignorance. So he quietly clutched that grain of wheat and went back to the palace and found a little gold box, and he placed that grain of wheat in the box. And every morning he would open the box to look for an answer, and he couldn't find any answers. And then a few days later, this intellectual came back on a return visit, and the king asked him to explain. And that's when the intellectual said, it's very simple. He said, as long as you keep this grain of wheat in this box, nothing is going to happen. It will eventually rot and perish, and that will be the end of the story. But if you had allowed this grain of wheat to interact with all the elements, if you had planted this outside in the soil, it would sprout and grow, and very soon you could have a whole field of wheat. And that is the meaning of peace. That if somebody has found peace and if they keep it locked up in their hearts for their own personal gains, it will perish with them. But if they let it interact with all the elements, it would grow, and very soon we could have a whole world of peacemakers. So I have come here this evening to give you the grain of wheat I got from my grandfather, and I hope that you won't let it rot and perish, but let it interact so that all of us together can transform this world and make it a better place for future generations. Thank you.